Have you ever found yourself grappling with some of life's biggest questions, like the relationship between faith and reason, or the very foundations of law and justice, or maybe even what it really means for something to exist?
Fundamental stuff.
Exactly. And what if I told you that many of the profound insights we still use to navigate these huge questions actually stem from the mind of a single colossal figure from way back in the 13th century?
That's precisely what we're here to unpack today. This deep dive is all about pulling back the curtain on let's say, the intricate tapestry of Thomas Aquinas' thought. He really stands as this undeniable towering intellect from the 13th century.
A period often sort of misunderstood, right? Like people just think Dark Ages.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
But it was actually an era of profound intellectual upheaval and, frankly, transformation, bursting with energy.
And to give you a shortcut, to truly understanding this intellectual giant, we've gone through a stack of sources, mostly expert academic excerpts, that give a pretty comprehensive look at his philosophy, his theology, and the incredible, almost unimaginable legacy he left behind.
Yeah, you can expect a journey that will illuminate not just what Aquinas thought, but maybe more importantly, why his ideas remain profoundly, even surprisingly relevant for us today.
So whether your interest lies in that perennial intersection of reason and faith, or maybe the historical roots of law and human rights, or even the surprising origins of early economic thinking.
We'll extract those crucial insights, those aha moments. The goal is to give you a genuine understanding of a mind that, well, literally shaped Western thought for centuries.
Okay, let's do it. Let's unpack this. To truly appreciate the seismic impact of Thomas Aquinas, we first need to set the historical and intellectual stage.
Right, context is everything here.
And forget that popular image of the Dark Ages. Our sources paint a very different picture of the 13th century, much more vibrant.
Absolutely. This was, in fact, an unprecedented period of intellectual enthusiasm, a genuine ferment of ideas across the Latin Christian world. It wasn't dark at all. It was buzzing with new curiosity and a real thirst for knowledge.
And the pulse, the intellectual pulse of the age, it beat strongest in the newly emerging universities, didn't it?
Definitely, particularly those burgeoning centers of learning in Italy and France.
Right.
Paris especially was a true focal point. These institutions weren't just places where knowledge was, passed
Oh
down.
no, they were more like intellectual laboratories.
Exactly. Melting pots were this massive, almost overwhelming influx of newly rediscovered texts by Aristotle arrived. And this wasn't just, oh, look, an old book.
No, it was a monumental event. It utterly challenged, invigorated, and fundamentally reshaped the existing theological and philosophical frameworks people were working with.
And here's where it gets really interesting and something often overlooked.
Mm.
These weren't just dusty old scrolls of Aristotle appearing out of thin air.
Right, they came with baggage, sort of. Good baggage.
Well, crucial accompanying scholarly annotations, what they call the shirs, from brilliant Islamic and Jewish commentators. Thinkers like Averroes, Maimonides.
So these weren't just footnotes. They were like detailed explanations, commentaries.
Precisely. And these commentaries brought entirely new, often complex, sometimes even controversial perspectives to these ancient works. Suddenly, established Christian theological thought had to grapple with this vast, coherent, and powerfully rational philosophical system.
A system that seemed maybe at times to contradict revelation?
That was the tension, absolutely. It forced a profound reevaluation of the relationship, the potential harmony between that classical philosophical heritage and Christian theology. It really pushed the boundaries of what was intellectually possible.
Okay, so this intellectual crucible, this dynamic clash and convergence of ideas, it gave rise to what we call the schola, right? The scholastic method.
That's it. And this wasn't just a style of debate or some loose way of thinking. It was a highly rigorous intellectual discipline, almost like a scientific method for philosophy and theology.
How did it actually work, though?
Well, its core process involved meticulously dissecting complex questions into the smallest, most manageable components. Then, scholars would resolve these components through really structured, logical argument schemas.
Like a legal brief, you mentioned? Or a flowchart?
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
Imagine every objection is raised, every counter-argument considered, every point systematically addressed before a final conclusion is reached. This method brought an unprecedented level of precision, clarity, almost forensic detail to the whole discourse. It allowed for incredibly nuanced arguments.
And it was right in the very eye of this intellectual storm, these intense clashes in Paris, that Thomas Aquinas found his unique position.
Absolutely central. He wasn't just another brilliant scholar contributing. Our sources describe his achievement as nothing less than constructing the most comprehensive synthesis of his era.
A synthesis of what, exactly?
He meticulously, almost painstakingly, wove Aristotle's systematic philosophy, which, remember, was seen as pagan thought by many, right into the very fabric of the dogmatic and sacred structure of Christian faith. It was an intellectual feat of staggering proportions.
And what made him different from others trying similar things?
What's truly fascinating here, when what really set him apart, is how he distinguished himself from his contemporaries. Many saw philosophy simply as the ancilla, the handmaiden, of theology.
Meaning its only job was to serve theology.
Exactly, to support doctrines, never to stand alone. But Aquinas went much, much further. He granted philosophy its own distinct autonomy. He carefully positioned reason and revelation not as sharply divided conflicting domains or as two truths that could contradict each other.
So not enemies, not master-servant, but partners.
More like distinct yet non-conflicting avenues to truth. He argued they shouldn't be mixed or blurred, but understood as different lights leading to the same ultimate reality. This was a truly radical stance for his time.
Wow. Okay, that sets the stage perfectly. So from this grand intellectual stage, let's zoom in on the man himself. The life of this dumb ox who roared.
Great nickname, isn't it? Thomas Aquinas was born around 1225 in Roccasecca Castle, down in the Kingdom of Naples. Came from a noble family, though maybe not the wealthiest.
And his path seems set early on.
Very early. At the incredibly tender age of 5, he was sent off to the Monte Cassino Benedictine monastery for education. This wasn't just early schooling, it was a clear signal. His family intended for him to become an abbot.
A traditional, prestigious path for someone of his standing, secure the family influence, all that.
Exactly. But that predetermined path took a completely unexpected turn. In 1239, he had to leave the monastery because of political strife involving the Emperor Frederick II.
Just a disruption, you'd think.
But it proved pivotal. He then transferred to the University of Naples. And it was there, in that vibrant intellectual atmosphere, that he first encountered the full power of Aristotle's physics and logic.
The spark.
A profound intellectual awakening. It really set his course.
Now, despite those aristocratic roots and his family's very clear plans, he made a really surprising, almost defiant decision in 1244, didn't he?
He absolutely did. He chose to join the Dominicans, the order of preachers, a relatively new and, importantly, mendicant meaning begging order in Italy at the time.
Which went directly against his family's expectations. I imagine they weren't pleased.
They were outraged.
Yeah.
Their protest wasn't just verbal, it was dramatic. They actually abducted him.
Abducted him?
Seriously. And subjected him to a year-long house arrest back at Roccasecca Castle. Imagine being a young man, full of intellectual fire, locked up by your own family.
That's unbelievable. Did it break his spirit?
Quite the opposite, apparently. Our sources say he used this confinement to intensely memorize sacred scriptures, study theological texts. It solidified his intellectual mastery and his spiritual passion. Ironically, it deepened the very convictions his family wanted to stamp out.
Wow, what a story of conviction. So he eventually got out.
He was released in 1245, maybe snuck out, maybe the Dominicans helped. The details are a bit hazy, but he immediately journeyed to Paris. There he began studying theology under the renowned Albertus Magnus, himself a towering intellectual.
And this is where the dumb ox story comes from.
Exactly. Albertus Magnus, observing Aquinas' quiet, reserved demeanor in class, affectionately nicknamed him the dumb ox. But then, and this is key, with astonishing foresight, Albertus added, "One day his bellowing will spread throughout the whole world."
Chills. It perfectly captures that quiet exterior hiding immense power.
Doesn't it? His intellectual development continued under Albert in Cologne from 1248 to 1252. That's when he really began his extensive commentaries on Aristotle, laying the groundwork.
And his academic career took off quickly after that.
Very quickly. By 1256, he achieved the esteemed title of Magister in Sacra, Paginate Professor of Sacred Scripture at the University of Paris. A huge deal.
And his influence spread beyond the university walls.
Oh, yes. He served as an advisor to Pope Alexander IV, lectured extensively in Rome from 1259. Then, at the request of Pope Clement IV, He managed the Studium Generale, a house of studies, at Santa Sabina from 1265 to 1268.
A busy man.
Incredibly. And it was during this prolific period, amidst all that advising and teaching, that he started work on his absolute magnum opus, the Summa Theologiae.
Just the sheer volume of work is staggering.
It really is. His final active years saw him return for a second teaching stint in Paris from 1269 to 1272. This period, though, was unfortunately overshadowed by intense intellectual battles, particularly the heated Averroism debates.
We'll get back to those, right?
Definitely. It shows the contentious environment he was still navigating. In 1272, he returned to Naples to open a new theology faculty.
But tragically, his journey was cut short.
Very sadly, yes. In January 1274, he fell seriously ill while traveling to the Second Council of Lyon. He passed away on March 7, 1274, at the Cistercian monastery of Fossa Nova.
And even after his death, the controversies didn't just stop.
Not at all. Just 6 months later, those infamous condemnations by Archbishop Etienne Tempier of Paris controversially listed some of Aquinas' own Aristotelian-influenced theses.
So even in death, his ideas were seen as dangerous.
By some, absolutely. It was a significant intellectual blow, showing the immediate suspicion his groundbreaking work faced from more conservative elements worried about pagan philosophy.
Yet, despite those challenges, his vindication eventually came.
And it was absolute and profound. Within decades, his legacy began to solidify. He was canonized as a saint by Pope John XXII in 1323. That's huge official recognition.
And later declared Dr. Angelicus.
The angelic doctor, yes, by Pope Pius V in 1567, cementing his status as a preeminent theological and philosophical voice within the Church. Quite a journey from dumb ox to angelic doctor.
Truly remarkable. Okay, to fully grasp that impact, we need to look at his monumental works. These are like the blueprint of his mind, right?
Absolutely. His main masterpiece, though technically incomplete, the fourth part was unfinished when he died, is the Summa Theologiae, written between 1265 and 1273. It's not just vast, it genuinely represents the absolute pinnacle of the scholastic form.
How is it structured? Can you break that down?
Sure. It has 3 major completed parts. Part 1 focuses on God as nature, attributes. Part 2 meticulously examines human beings and their ultimate goal, which is God. And Part 3 explores Jesus Christ and the sacraments.
And the structure itself, that quaestio articulus corpus responsio form.
Right. It's the most proficient example. Think of it like this. A quaestio is the main question. Say, does God exist? Then it breaks down into articulus, specific articles or sub-questions.
Okay.
Each article starts with arguments against the position Aquinas will take the objections. Then comes the sed contra, a counter-argument, often from authority, pointing the other way. After that is the corpus, the body, where Aquinas lays out his own detailed argument, his responsio, his answer. And finally, he goes back and responds to each initial objection, showing how his answer resolves them.
Wow. That sounds incredibly meticulous, almost like preempting every possible disagreement.
Exactly. Rigorous, forensic. It allows for an unbelievable exploration of complex topics with unparalleled clarity and intellectual honesty. It's a masterclass in systematic thought.
Then there's the Summa contra Gentiles, written a bit earlier. Different purpose.
Different purpose, but equally crucial. It wasn't primarily for internal Christian debate. It was specifically conceived as a rational apologia, a defense of Christian faith aimed at non-Christian thinkers, specifically Muslims and Jews of his time.
So reaching outside his own circle, trying to find common ground and reason.
Precisely. And what's brilliant about Summa contra Gentiles is its logical progression. The first 3 books are grounded entirely in natural reason. Aquinas aims to establish God's existence and attributes using arguments accessible to anyone, regardless of religious belief.
Using just philosophy, basically.
Purely philosophical arguments, yes. No reliance on revelation yet. Only in the 4th and final book does he transition to explicitly Christian beliefs based on revelation, like the Trinity or the Incarnation.
That shows a real sophistication in how he approached different audiences, doesn't it? Showing how reason can prepare the ground for faith.
Exactly. Reason can take you so far, but faith completes the picture. Then, beyond these big systematic works, his commentaria in Aristotelem, his commentaries on Aristotle's major works like De Anima, Metaphysica, Ethica, Nicomacheia, are incredibly significant.
Why are they so important?
Because they're not just summaries. They offer a direct, unfiltered window into Aquinas' own meticulous reading of Aristotle. This was absolutely central to his whole project of synthesis. You see exactly how he engaged with his main philosophical source.
And he also wrote these questiones disputati, disputed questions.
Yes, on topics like truth, de veritate, power, de potentia, evil, de malo, the soul, the anima. These came out of his public disputed lectures, which were a big part of university life back then, often quite heated.
So more free form than the Summa.
A bit, yeah. More exploratory, sometimes more dynamic. They allowed him to construct and explore original concepts, reflecting the actual give and take of academic debate. Shows his intellectual agility.
And finally, the Opuscula, the small treatises. Any highlights there?
Definitely. The Ante et Essentia, on being in essence, written remarkably early, around 1248, 1252, is foundational. Is where he first formulated his groundbreaking theory of the essence-existence distinction.
Ah, that one. We need to unpack that.
We absolutely do. It permeates his entire system. Other small treatises like Compendium Theologiae or De Radio, which discusses monarchy and theocracy, show the incredible breadth of his interests way beyond just metaphysics into practical political philosophy. De Radio has some surprisingly progressive ideas about resisting tyranny.
Okay, let's shift gears now. From the life and works to the core philosophy itself, the pillars of his thought, starting with that metaphysics and the esse essentia distinction you mentioned.
Right, the essence-existence distinction. It's absolutely pivotal.
It sounds complex. Break it down for us.
Okay, let's try. Aquinas argued that in every composite being, and that means everything in the created world made of parts or principles, there's a fundamental distinction. There's essentia, which is what something is, its essence, its nature, its whatness.
Like what makes a dog a dog?
Exactly. And then there's esse, which is the very act of existing. It's isness, it's being. The fact that the dog is...
Okay, essence and existence. Why is that distinction such a big deal?
Because this is where he profoundly moves beyond Aristotle's matter-form idea. For Aquinas, esse, the pure act of existing itself, isn't just another property. It's the most fundamental actuality. It's the highest level of the act-potency relationship.
More fundamental than what it's made of or its shape.
Even more fundamental than that. Think of a statue. It is marble, matter, and has a shape form. But for Aquinas, the sheer act of that statue being there at all, its isness, is the ultimate actuality.
Wow. Okay.
And here's the crucial theological point. In God, this distinction simply doesn't exist. God, for Aquinas, is identical with existence itself. He is ipsum esse subsistent, self-subsistent being.
So God doesn't have existence, God is existent.
Precisely. Which puts God in an entirely different category of being. It's a radical insight that redefines how you understand everything else in relation to the Creator.
Okay, that's huge. And from that understanding of being, he moves to proving God's existence with the Quinque Viae, the 5 ways.
Right, found early in the Summa Theology. And what's crucial is these aren't just abstract arguments, they derive directly from observing the world around us.
Can you quickly list them?
Sure. First, motion. Things are moving. Something must have started the motion, the first mover. Second, causality. Everything has a cause, must be a first cause. Third, contingency necessity. Things exist that don't have to exist, so there must be a necessary being.
Okay, 3 down.
Fourth, degrees of perfection. We see better and worse things, implying a maximum perfection, God. And fifth, teleology or governance. The world shows order and purpose, pointing to an intelligent designer guiding it.
And the key thing is these are a posteriori arguments, meaning
They start from observed effects in the universe, motion, causality, etc., and reason backward to the ultimate cause, God. They're grounded in experience, in Aristotelian ideas of causes.
which makes them different from, say, Anselm's ontological argument.
Totally different. Anselm argues from the concept of God in the mind. Aquinas argues from what we can see and experience in the world. It's about reasoning from reality to its source.
Makes sense. Now, how about epistemology? How did he think we acquire knowledge?
Well, for Aquinas, it starts quite empirically, with sensory impressions. Knowledge begins with what our senses perceive.
But our minds aren't just passive recorders, are they?
No, the intellectus agens, the active intellect, plays a key role. It actively abstracts universal forms, or intelligible concepts, from the raw phantasms, the specific images and data our senses gather.
So we see a particular tree, and our active intellect pulls out the universal concept of treeness.
That's the basic idea, which leads to his view on universals, universalia in rebus.
Meaning universes are where?
They are real concepts in the mind, but they reflect real distinctions and commonalities that exist in things themselves. It's a form of moderate realism.
So not just names we make up and not floating ideas in some separate realm.
Exactly, a middle ground. Our concepts are grounded in the way things actually are.
Okay. And how does this relate to talking about God? If God is so different, how can our language even apply?
Huge challenge. And his solution is the crucial principle of analogia in entis, the analogy of being.
Analogy of being. Explain that.
Well, when we use words like good or wise for God, we're using human language. But God is infinite. So is God good exactly like a human is good?
Hmm.
No, that's projecting our limits onto God, anthropomorphism.
But is the word meaningless then?
No, that's the other extreme of patheticism, saying we can only say what God is not. Aquinas says neither. The terms are used analogously,
Hmm.
meaning they're not used in an identical way, nor a completely different way, but in a way that's proportionally similar. God is good, but in a transcendent, perfect, infinite way that our limited human goodness participates in or reflects. He loves for meaningful, though always limited, talk about God. It's incredibly subtle.
Very clever. Okay, let's move to his ethics and politics. So what was the ultimate goal for human life, according to Aquinas?
The ultimate goal, the highest human good, is the visio beatifica, the beatific vision. Seeing God face to face, that's ultimate happiness and fulfillment.
And how do we work towards that in this life? Through natural law.
Natural law, or lex naturalis, is fundamental here. He argued that, as rational creatures, we can discern this law inherently. It's the basic moral principle, do good, avoid evil. It's known through our practical reason.
No, it's not just revealed commands. It's something we can figure out.
Exactly. Inscribed in our nature, a reflection of divine wisdom. Even without specific revelation, humans grasp fundamental moral truths.
And he brought in Aristotle's virtues too, right?
He did. He integrated Aristotle's four cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance, which we acquire through practice. And then he completed them with the three theological virtues: faith, hope, and charity.
Which are different how?
They're infused by God's grace, not just acquired by effort. It shows that beautiful weaving together of classical wisdom and Christian revelation in his moral system.
What about politics? How did he see political authority?
His views were surprisingly forward-thinking. He argued political authority isn't necessarily divinely ordained in its specific form. God doesn't demand monarchy, for instance. Rather, it's a necessity of the natural order for humans to live well together.
So its legitimacy comes from?
It's aimed to achieve the bonum commune, the
Right.
common good. While he generally preferred monarchy, what's really revolutionary is what he says in De Regno.
Which is?
He argues that tyranny, a ruler acting against the common good, actually justifies the res publica, the people or the state, in overthrowing the tyrant.
Whoa, legitimate resistance in the 13th century. That's radical.
Incredibly progressive, it empowers the populace against abuse of power.
Okay, one last core philosophical point. The boundaries between theology and philosophy, the two lights.
Yes, a beautiful and enduring analogy. Philosophia, the light of the mind, deals with what we can know through reason, observation, logic. Divine revelation communicates mysteries beyond reason's natural reach. The Trinity, the Incarnation, things we couldn't discover ourselves.
But crucially, they can't contradict.
Absolutely impossible for Aquinas, because the same God created human reason and is the source of revelation. Truth cannot contradict truth.
And the implication of that?
It preserves philosophy's autonomy. Reason can do its work independently while maintaining a higher unity where all truth ultimately converges, critical for allowing both science and theology to flourish.
Okay, now, despite these monumental achievements, Aquinas faced some serious intellectual battles, didn't he? It wasn't all smooth sailing.
Far from it. The 13th century was rife with intellectual skirmishes. One major challenge was Latin Averroism.
What was that about?
Championed by figures like Sigurd of Brabant in Paris, it took ideas from the Islamic philosopher Averroes and radicalized the reason-revelation divide. It led to the dangerous idea of double truth.
Double truth, meaning?
Meaning something could be philosophically true according to reason, but theologically false according to faith, or vice versa, implying a fundamental contradiction, splitting truth in two.
And Aquinas rejected that.
Vehemently. He saw it as intellectually incoherent and spiritually damaging. For example, Averroists argued for a single universal intellect for all humans, denying individual immortality. Aquinas passionately defended the individual soul's immortality, reaffirming the unity of truth. The stakes were incredibly high.
And then came the condemnations of 1270 and 1277, even after his death.
Well, 1270 was just before, but 1277 was indeed after. Led by Archbishop Tempier of Paris, these condemned certain Aristotelian propositions deemed dangerous, like the idea of an eternal created world, which seemed to contradict Genesis, or ideas that seemed to limit God's freedom.
And some of Aquinas' own ideas got caught up in that.
Controversially, yes. Or at least propositions interpreted as his were included. It shows the intense suspicion his integration of Aristotle faced. Many saw it as too bold, too close to pagan thought.
Yet, despite that immediate backlash,
The long-term arc was definitely in his favor. His intellectual depth won out. The Church eventually made his doctrine its standard, and much later in the modern era, his thought saw a huge resurgence with Neo-Thomism.
Neo-Thomism, when was that?
It really took off in the 19th century, especially with Pope Leo III's encyclical Toni Patris in 1879. This papal directive basically reestablished Aquinas as the foundation for Catholic philosophy and theology.
A deliberate move to ground modern thought in his rigor.
Exactly. Believing his framework was the most robust for addressing modern challenges. And this continued strongly into the 20th century, with brilliant thinkers like Etienne Gilson and Jacques Maritain.
What did they do?
They adapted his metaphysics of being, that S-centered ontology, to engage with contemporary philosophy, showed his thought wasn't a relic, but a living tradition. Then there was the ressourcement movement after Vatican II, emphasizing a return to sources, which further highlighted Aquinas' coherence and relevance.
So, bringing it all together, what does this mean for us today? How does this 13th century thinker still impact our world? His legacy seems immense.
It truly is, far beyond just theology. First, he revolutionized scholastic thought in university education. His systematic approach and integration of logic shaped centuries of intellectual inquiry. Everyone after him had to engage with his framework.
And his influence on legal theory. You mentioned human rights.
Absolutely. His natural law doctrine is incredibly influential. It laid a foundational pathway for modern human rights discourse. The idea of inherent universal rights grounded in human nature. You can trace that right back to Aquinas.
Thinkers like Grotius or John Finnis built on that.
Directly. They acknowledge their debt. It's a clear lineage from medieval thought to modern concepts of justice.
And even economics. That seems surprising.
It does, but in the Summa, his discussions on the just price, its patriotium, laid crucial groundwork for thinking about interest, usury, the value of labor. He brought an ethical lens to economic transactions.
So not just supply and demand, but fairness.
Exactly, a moral dimension. Those ideas still resonate in discussions about fair trade and ethical economics today.
And maybe most relevant now, his contribution to the religion-science dialogue. The two lights again.
Incredibly relevant. By arguing truth can't contradict truth because reason, science, and revelation, theology, share the same divine source. He opened a path for coexistence.
Meaning science doesn't have to conflict with faith.
Precisely. Scientific discoveries can be seen as illuminating different facets of the same reality described by theology. His framework allows science and faith to be consistent, even complementary. It's still a powerful model for dialogue today.
So Thomas Aquinas really represents the absolute peak of scholastic synthesis, doesn't he?
The zenith, yes. He connected Aristotle's understanding of existence with divine existence, making him arguably the most rigorous theologian and the most broad-minded philosopher of the Middle Ages.
His brilliance was bridging reason and faith so seamlessly.
Masterfully. And his essay-centered ontology, focusing on the act of existing, brought philosophy down to earth, connecting it to the concrete world without losing its theological depth.
And it's striking how concepts we still use today, essence existence, analogy, natural law, echo his original formulations.
Absolutely. His vocabulary, his intellectual architecture remains incredibly relevant.
He really holds that dual identity. Peak of medieval thought, but also a vital artery for modern rationality.
Which is why he's rightly called Dr. Communis, the common doctor. His insights remain universally applicable.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the mind of Thomas Aquinas, here's something to think about. Given his core belief that reason and faith can't contradict because they come from the same divine source, what contemporary areas where we see conflict between science and spiritual belief might actually benefit from adopting his two lights perspective? Where might we be missing the harmony just by looking through a single lens?
That's a great question to ponder. Are we imposing conflict where he saw potential unity? Definitely something for you, the listener, to mull over.